What if the biggest influence in Latin America wasn't the United States anymore, but China? Over the past decade, China has quietly become a major player across Latin America, investing billions in ports, highways, mines, and energy projects. From Brazil to Peru, Chinese companies are building the infrastructure that keeps economies moving and gaining long-term influence in the process. This growing presence has caught Washington's attention once again. For the United States, Latin America has always been considered its strategic backyard. But today, China is offering something different: fast money, fewer political conditions, and massive trade opportunities. Countries facing economic pressure are listening. Now, the U.S. is re-engaging the region, pushing new trade deals, development funds, and diplomatic efforts to counter China's rise. The question is no longer if China is reshaping Latin America, but how far this shift will go, and whether the United States can keep up in a rapidly changing global power game. For most of the last 2 centuries, Latin America existed under a simple geopolitical assumption: the United States was the dominant external power in the region. From trade and diplomacy to security and political influence, Washington shaped much of Latin America's relationship with the wider world. This influence was so deeply rooted that it was rarely questioned. But today, that assumption is no longer guaranteed. A quiet yet powerful shift has been taking place, one that is now forcing the United States to look south again with renewed urgency. That shift is China. Over the past 20 years, China has transformed from a distant economic partner into one of Latin America's most influential players. What began as limited trade in raw materials has evolved into a complex web of investments, infrastructure projects, technology partnerships, and political relationships. Chinese companies now build ports in the Caribbean, operate mines in the Andes, finance highways in Central America, and supply telecom networks across the region. In many Latin American countries, China has become either the first or second largest trading partner, rivaling or even surpassing the United States. What makes this transformation remarkable is not just its scale, but its speed and how quietly it happened. While the United States was focused on wars in the Middle East, internal political divisions, and strategic competition in Europe and East Asia, China was patiently expanding its footprint in Latin America. Beijing did not arrive with military bases or ideological campaigns. Instead, it came with loans, construction contracts, and long-term economic promises. For governments struggling with debt, infrastructure gaps, and slow development, China appeared as a pragmatic partner willing to invest where others hesitated. This growing Chinese presence has reshaped the economic landscape of the region. Latin America exports vast amounts of soybeans, copper, lithium, oil, and iron ore to fuel China's massive industrial machine. In return, Chinese manufactured goods flood local markets, from electronics to machinery. Beyond trade, China has poured billions of dollars into energy projects, including hydroelectric dams, solar farms, and oil refineries. These investments have created jobs and boosted growth, but they have also raised concerns about dependency, environmental damage, and political leverage. For many Latin American leaders, China represents opportunity. Unlike traditional Western lenders, Chinese financing often comes with fewer public conditions related to governance, human rights, or economic reform. This makes it attractive to governments seeking fast results or political flexibility. But critics argue that these deals sometimes lack transparency and saddle countries with long-term debt obligations, giving Beijing significant influence over national decisions. As China's role has expanded, the United States has begun to take notice, and not without concern. From Washington's perspective, Latin America is not just another region, it is strategically vital. It is geographically close, deeply interconnected through trade, migration, and culture, and historically aligned with U.S. interests. The idea that a rival global power could gain substantial influence so close to American borders has triggered alarms across political and security circles in the United States. The concern goes beyond economics. U.S. officials worry about China's involvement in critical infrastructure such as ports, telecommunications networks, and energy grids, assets that could carry strategic or security implications. The spread of Chinese technology, especially in areas like 5G networks and surveillance systems, has intensified fears about data security and political influence. At the same time, China's diplomatic efforts, including persuading countries to switch recognition from Taiwan to Beijing, highlight its growing political reach. Yet this situation did not emerge overnight, nor is it solely the result of Chinese ambition. Many analysts argue that the United States' own disengagement created the space China has filled. For years, Latin American leaders complained of neglect, inconsistent policies, and a lack of meaningful economic engagement from Washington. Trade agreements stalled, development aid declined, and diplomatic attention shifted elsewhere. In contrast, China offered a consistent message: partnership, investment, and mutual benefit. Now, the United States is trying to reassert its presence. In recent years, Washington has launched new initiatives aimed at strengthening economic ties, promoting sustainable development, and countering China's influence. Programs focused on infrastructure financing, clean energy, and supply chain resilience are being presented as alternatives to Chinese-backed projects. U.S. officials are also emphasizing shared democratic values, transparency, and long-term stability as key differences between American and Chinese engagement. However, winning back influence will not be easy. Latin America today is more politically diverse and strategically independent than ever before. Many countries no longer want to choose sides in a global power rivalry. Instead, they seek to balance relationships, working with China, the United States, Europe, and others to maximize their own interests. This multipolar approach reflects a broader global trend in which emerging economies assert greater autonomy in international affairs. At the heart of this story lies a fundamental question: is China's rise in Latin America a threat, an opportunity, or simply a reflection of a changing world order? For the United States, the challenge is to move beyond fear-driven responses and offer genuine, long-term engagement that addresses the region's real needs. For Latin America, the challenge is to navigate great power competition without sacrificing sovereignty, sustainability, or social stability. And for China, the region represents both a testing ground for its global ambitions and a reminder that influence comes with responsibility. As global power continues to shift, Latin America is no longer just watching history unfold, it is actively shaping it. And as China's presence deepens and the United States refocuses its attention, the future of the region will be defined by choices made today, in a world where influence is no longer taken for granted, and dominance is no longer assured. China's growing presence in Latin America did not begin with a grand strategy announcement or a dramatic political shift. Instead, it started quietly, through trade. In the early 2000s, China's rapid industrial growth created an enormous demand for raw materials. Latin America, rich in natural resources, was a perfect match. Soybeans from Brazil and Argentina, copper from Chile and Peru, oil from Venezuela and Ecuador, and iron ore from across the region began flowing east in massive quantities. This trade relationship grew at astonishing speed. Within just 2 decades, China became one of Latin America's top trading partners, and in some countries, the largest. But trade was only the first step. What followed was far more strategic. As China accumulated foreign reserves and its state-owned companies expanded globally, Beijing began offering something Latin America urgently needed: infrastructure financing. Roads, ports, railways, power plants, and dams, projects that had long been delayed due to lack of funding, were suddenly possible. Chinese banks stepped in where Western lenders were hesitant, providing large loans backed by long repayment periods and, in some cases, future commodity exports. One of China's most powerful tools in the region has been its development banks. Institutions like the China Development Bank and the Export-Import Bank of China have lent tens of billions of dollars to Latin American governments and state-owned companies. These loans often funded energy and transportation projects critical to national development. For countries struggling with budget constraints or limited access to international credit markets, Chinese financing appeared fast, flexible, and reliable. Infrastructure became the physical symbol of China's presence. Chinese firms helped expand ports in Panama and Peru, built highways in Colombia, and invested in rail projects connecting inland regions to export hubs. These projects did more than boost trade. They reshaped supply chains and strengthened China's long-term access to key resources. Energy was another major focus. China invested heavily in oil, gas, and electricity across the region. In Venezuela, Chinese loans were repaid with oil shipments. In Brazil, Chinese companies acquired stakes in major energy firms and power grids. Renewable energy also became a growing area of cooperation, with Chinese-backed solar and wind projects spreading across Argentina, Chile, and Mexico. Alongside infrastructure and energy came technology. Chinese telecom companies expanded rapidly in Latin America, offering affordable equipment and modern networks. Smartphones, surveillance systems, and internet infrastructure made by Chinese firms became common across the region. This technological expansion raised efficiency and connectivity, but it also raised concerns, particularly in Washington, about data security and strategic dependence. Diplomatically, China deepened its ties through consistent engagement. High-level visits, regional forums, and long-term cooperation plans signaled that Beijing viewed Latin America not as a temporary opportunity, but as a permanent partner. China invited Latin American countries into its global initiatives, presenting cooperation as part of a shared future rather than a transactional relationship. One of the most significant developments was the region's growing participation in China's global connectivity vision, often referred to as the Belt and Road Initiative. Several Latin American countries formally joined, opening the door to further investment and cooperation. While the projects varied in scale and success, the political message was clear: China had arrived as a long-term actor. This expansion did not occur without controversy. Critics in Latin America raised concerns about environmental damage, labor practices, and transparency. Some projects faced delays, cost overruns, or public opposition. Others sparked debates about debt sustainability and economic dependence on commodity exports. Yet despite these challenges, many governments continued to welcome Chinese involvement, seeing it as a necessary counterbalance to traditional Western influence. For China, Latin America offered more than resources and markets. It provided diplomatic support on the global stage, access to strategic waterways, and a chance to demonstrate that its development model could succeed beyond Asia and Africa. Each new partnership strengthened Beijing's narrative as a global leader offering alternatives to US-led systems. Meanwhile, the United States was watching this transformation unfold, slowly at first, then with growing concern. What had once seemed like routine trade relations were now clearly something more. China was embedding itself economically, politically, and technologically across an entire region. And the deeper these ties grew, the harder they would be to reverse. By the time Washington fully refocused its attention, the landscape had already changed. Latin America was no longer a region where U.S. influence was assumed. It had become a competitive space, one where China had gained a strong and lasting foothold. In the next part, the focus turns to why the United States sees this shift as a strategic challenge, and how Washington is responding to China's rise so close to home.